Hey everybody, Eric Dorward here with the Spartan Rocketry Club, and I'm continuing my build of the Estes Great Goblin. And it is time to go kind of off the directions here, and I'm going to be using some epoxy in this episode. I'm going to be accomplishing two things. One is, so the motor mount here is glued in place, but I'm going to put epoxy reinforcements around, well, a lot, if not all of the joints. And then I'm going to glue epoxy the thing inside the body tube. So I need to take a few precautions here. One is I'm going to be wearing gloves. I usually just wear one glove when doing this, but I have a tendency of getting a little sloppy when I put fillets on. So I'm going to put some gloves on both hands this time, just out of an abundance of caution. Should always wear gloves when working with epoxy because it can produce reactions. They're cumulative and lifelong. So, always a good idea to wear gloves, even if you worked with it before and never had a problem. All right, so we'll deal with that in a moment here. One thing before we get started is here is an engine block. There is actually not an engine block in this kit. This just happens to be one that I happen to have. There's a reason that there is no engine block in this. You could certainly put one in if you wanted to, but you'll notice that this tube is a lot longer than a motor, even a 29 millimeter black powder motor, which is huge. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's enormous, but this is quite a bit longer than the motor. The reason that there isn't one of these things in the kit is because I think Estes just kind of assumes that if you're going to be buying something that uses a 29 millimeter motor, you're probably going to use a composite motor at some point, maybe just exclusively, maybe instead of the black powder motor, but maybe just as a replacement for it. If you use such a thing, the length of the motor depends on how much not powder, but how much fuel you want to put into it. So they're not all the same length. So if you put this in, you limit yourself to a very specific size and shape and ultimately power that you put in there. So if you're only going to use black powder, yeah, you certainly could and probably should put one of these in there. No harm. But you also probably don't need to take all the time to epoxy things either. So anyway, so I'm not putting that in. I don't actually know what I'm going to fly this on. I probably could put it in at the length of a 29 millimeter black powder motor, but we're just not going to bother with that. All right, so the way this is going to work is this tube is going to fit in like this. It's supposed to end up, line up basically flush with the bottom. We'll have to finesse that a little bit. And then the fins are going to fit through the crack here. But remember, there are slots in this part of the ring. So I need to be very careful to get those centered through the slot like that, not like that. You see the gap. If I do this correctly, this will fit in and the whole fin will fit nice and flush and it'll be strong. If I have this off by a bit, this is as far as it's going to go. And that's clearly a problem. That's no good. So I do have the fins out. I'm going to use them to test fit everything once I'm ready to go. All right, so let's whip up some epoxy here. I am using 5-minute epoxy. It's binary, so it's got two parts. You probably should measure this out if you really, really want to be completely accurate with it, but I just kind of eyeball it. So I squeeze out what appear to be equal amounts into a disposable cup and stir it up, and then you got 5 minutes. So I got 5 minutes to get the epoxy onto the tube, the motor mount, and then into the tube here. I did one extra thing that's worth mentioning. The instructions tell you where you're supposed to be putting the epoxy, and it actually does matter. Typically, I would put some just behind this slit and just in front of this slit and kind of arbitrarily up here. That's actually not going to cut it this time. I do need to be somewhat precise because this, right, it's going to fit kind of like this. So some of the epoxy is going to have to go fairly accurately where this ring is going to be centered. So in order to do that, I have my epoxy attaching stick here. And I've marked off a couple measurements. So I've got this one is 2.5. That's going to be midway through the slot. And this one here is going to be the far one up. All right, so prep work done. Let's get down to it. By the way, this stuff is probably not all that great to be breathing in either. It smells terrible. And once I'm done with this, I am going to put it outside. I think probably just in my garage, but certainly not in my house because it smells terrible and I'm pretty confident it's not good to be breathing in. All right, stirring up the two components. All right, and the clock is ticking. I'm going to do my best to, actually, you know what? I'm going to put down a piece of newspaper because I don't want to get this stuff on my cutting board. All right, so I'm just going to kind of brush this into all the cracks. It's kind of hard to do a good solid fillet with this stuff without getting your fingers in there, which even wearing a glove, I don't want to do that. So it's not going to be the world's best bond here. Oh, that's okay. And I'm going to use the stick here to just kind of smooth the excess out and go on to the next one. That first one, the one that's going to be on the outside of the rocket, that one you actually need to be somewhat careful with because we have to put the retention system on later. And if you have a ton of glue, epoxy, sitting on top of it, that would be bad. Similarly, I don't want to get an absolute ton of epoxy on either of these joints where I am putting the fins because the fins have to fit somewhat snugly around this. Now, the epoxy doesn't take up that much space, but still, you don't need to have a ton of excess. You don't want a ton of excess here. It's not going to help make things stronger. It's just going to get in the way. So I am going to spread this out somewhat carefully. I'm going to use the fins to test fit everything, but I'm certainly not going to leave the fins in place because I'm not ready to actually bond them into place. So I'm going to try to keep the amount of epoxy that I might end up kind of smearing when I test fit everything to a minimum, hence the smearing to get this in place. All right, last fillet here. This one matters the least, I guess, when it comes to accuracy, but still, you know, might as well do a decent job. All right, so there's the motor mount. Now it's time to put the epoxy inside the tube. I'm going to just get this out of the way for the moment. I'm going to work from the deepest part of the rocket in because I don't want to get any of this on myself if I can help it. And if I'm starting all the way out, that should be less of an issue. All right, so I'm going to use the measuring line that I drew on my stick as kind of like a depth gauge. And I'm going to smear the epoxy inside. And notice too, I'm going to give this like a spin here so I'm not dripping it all over the place. If I have all that extra excess, I don't need it. So it can go back into the cup. I'm not being horribly precise with this. I'm going to end up pushing a lot of this final bit of epoxy up the tube anyway. So, no harm on that if you don't get it in exactly where you had the measuring line. In fact, it's probably better to come up short than to come up and put it in too deep. Then you have a ring of glue that's not gluing anything. That, of course, would be pretty useless. All right, so I have a nice broad amount of epoxy there. Now I'm going to go and do the middle ring, and I'm going to try to be a little precise about this. I don't really want the epoxy coming up through the gaps here, so I've got my finger basically telling me how far in this needs to go. And I'm going to do this in 4 separate batches instead of just kind of arbitrarily like I had been before. So 1 application per segment of the tube, as it is split by the through the tube construction cuts. Which, by the way, it's always nice when you do not have to cut them yourself. Because I've certainly done kits where you have to do the through the fin cut yourself, and it's fine, but it tends to be somewhat inaccurate. All right, I'm going to take the last bit. Now, I did not measure the 1/2 inch. I'm just going to put it not exactly at the edge, but pretty close to it. And it looks like I did a pretty good job at eyeballing how much of this stuff I would need. So that's always nice. I'm running a little low, but I only need 1, maybe 2 more blobs of this stuff. 1 blob. All right. Okay, everything's in place. I'm going to get this out of the way. This isn't like CA, so it doesn't, I just touched it. It's a good thing I'm wearing a glove. It doesn't bond like instantly, but still. All right, so I've turned the tube kind of diagonally here to avoid as much of the first 2 lines of this as I could. And now I'm going to push it in the rest of the way, and I need to twist. There, that looks decent. I'm going to stand this up just quickly to try to get it the proper depth. Now, just because I have it flush at the end doesn't mean this is perfectly accurate. So now it's time for test fitting with the fin. And that looks pretty good. I'm actually going to put several of them in just to double check. They should all fit in nice and even easily. And if they don't, well, that's a problem. Again, I am not leaving these in. These are just for testing purposes. They all fit pretty nicely. So I'm going to take them out quickly. I'm going to check, see if I got any epoxy goop on the fins somewhere that I wouldn't want. But otherwise, this looks pretty good. The epoxy was starting to get a little bit tacky already. So I'm not going to worry too much about things running anywhere. But we'll just let that sit for the time being. Now, I am going to put an epoxy fillet. The question is, am I going to use epoxy or am I going to use epoxy clay down at the bottom here around the interior where it bonds to the main tube? But I'm not going to do that today, regardless of what I choose to do. It would be nice to get an epoxy fillet all the way down here too, wherever that's a long way, but we'll not worry about that right now. So that takes care of my epoxy work. Gloves are done. This cup needs to go outside, like right in the trash, right in the way, It smells terrible. The fins, they look fine. There's nothing noticeable on them. So we're good to go. All right. This needs to dry for probably a day. I'll just let it go for a day, and then we'll see about getting the fins in. That'll require more epoxy. Yay. All right. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.